Good morning, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those who are watching online. My name is Tristan Tyrrell. I am the Programme Officer for Biodiversity and Climate Change in Dry and Subhumid Lands at the CBD Secretariat. That's a Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event and to thank UNEP for hosting us in their pavilion. The subject of the discussion today is to look at the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted almost a year ago to the day. It was on the 19th of December last year. And the intention with the framework is to address the devastating loss of biodiversity, recognizing that it is undermining our own social and ecological resilience, our own insurance on this planet, and of course linking that to climate change and the threat, the existential threat that that is posing. We can't be dealing with these two issues in silos. They need to be worked on, they need to be addressed together as one. And it's in a sense heartening to hear how nature is coming up the agenda here at COP28, that parties in this process are starting to recognize to a certain extent the value of nature in some of their climate actions. But of course, it's a lot of words, it's a lot of good statements, but ultimately it comes down to implementation. And the issue is that how are we supporting those parties, those governments, as well as all of society in terms of implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Paris Agreement, hopefully together, cohesively, synergistically, so that we're actually going to achieve our various goals and targets and put us properly on track to living in harmony with nature. So I have an esteemed panel joining us today, and the intention is to look at the role of the UN system in supporting this implementation. So on the stage from left to right, right to left, depending on which way you're facing, we have Maximilian Pardo from UNDESA, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. It's Department, yeah, great, thank you very much. Leanne Roper from UNDRR, Office on Disaster Risk Reduction. Claudia Ortiz, representing UNDP, UN Development Programme. Valerie Capos from UNEP WCMC, that's the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And Hani Morgani, who is she works for an agency in Iran, but she is a board member of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, as well as a representative of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. We're coming to the end of COP, so things are slowly winding down. But Marshall, is that you? Hi, welcome. Sorry, I wasn't sure. If you'd like to join us. And last but definitely not least, Marshall Bernu from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So thank you very much. So the idea with this event is to have a bit of a discussion more than a series of presentations, but to learn more about the kind of work that you are doing with your agencies in terms of supporting the GBF, but also in the context of where we are today at COP28, looking at it from the joint crises that we are facing and how we're going to address this. So I'm going to start with you, Val, if that's okay, just to put you on the spot to set things in motion. So obviously, we talk about the role of nature, and there's various discussions and uses of terms within this process that seem to link with the GBF. But of course, it's about understanding what that actually means in practice. And so I'd like to hear from you on what WCMC is doing in terms of helping us understand what all these various terms mean and trying to bring it forward. So a nice, easy question to start us off. Over to you.
Really quite cruel.
I know.
WCMC's, UNEP WCMC, I hasten to add, has been working very much at this interface between the climate change process and the biodiversity process for a really long time, and that our focus on that interface has been increasing the whole of UNEP WCMC supports the whole of the GBF, I would say, between the various things that amongst the various things that the organization does, including tracking global progress on area-based conservation, understanding quite a lot about species conservation, and so on. But I think the place where the nexus, I'm going to use the word nexus, oh, very exciting. The place where we work that hits the nexus between climate change and biodiversity is very much on the role of nature-based solutions. And we now have an impact area as part of our strategy, which is about focusing on nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches. We've been working on ecosystem-based adaptation since before the term was coined by the CBD. But the entire point is, in fact, a very large part of the point of the GBF, which is the absolute vital role of nature in supporting people and our ability to cope with climate change at all. And conversely, the vulnerability of the world's ecosystems and species to the impacts of climate change and what effect that might have on our resilience. So I think the place I would start is the role of nature in underpinning people's ability to confront and survive climate change, so both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And the first thing I always say when I talk about nature-based solutions is it's not all about carbon, please remember that. I usually talk about resilience. So the role of nature in underpinning our resilience and therefore the absolutely critical importance of making sure that we enable nature itself to be resilient in the face of climate change. And that then brings us back to everything that the Global Biodiversity Framework is asking us to do. I'll stop there. I'm not sure whether that was enough institutional role stuff, but we can come back to it.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Val. Absolutely. So one of the issues maybe with nature-based solutions is people are latching onto it without fully understanding maybe the nuances within it, what it actually means. And we're seeing some of that in some of the draft text coming out of here when they're starting to talk about, when they're using words like ecosystems and things like that, what is actually meant, what's behind that? And nature-based solutions has the potential of being nice and glossy. It's a nice thing that's been taken up by some, potentially, that without necessarily fully understanding what that means. And there's a lot of focus also with forests in this particular process, and the expectation, as you're saying, it's not just about carbon, but it's about that sort of ecosystem integrity behind that. Marshall, I'm gonna move to you next, if you don't mind. So within the FAO, obviously, you're looking at issues around sort of food security, forestry, so many things that are linked to land use change. And obviously, there's a lot of, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of focus on forests and things like that within this process. But of course, it all has to be done in a sustainable and effective manner. What sort of support is FAO providing in terms of trying to link with the GBF, certainly, but also across these two agendas, please?
Thanks for the question, and also I will follow up on what you were mentioning. It's true that biodiversity for so long have been seen mostly forest or native ecosystem issue, and it's also agriculture. It's also land that has been used and managed by people, by farmers, by pastoralism, by elders, and so on. So biodiversity, basically, it's all ecosystem, natural, but also managed by men. And we have seen in the recent year really a good move toward a more holistic approach. And the GBF is really a breakthrough for us because basically it put also not only the forest, on the forest we are already working a lot. We have a full forestry department, but all FAO, we are very concerned by food security. On food security and biodiversity, now we have, I would say, the best picture or the best nexus where we can work on, because we're now looping on climate change, biodiversity, and all other environmental challenges and trying to address that in one unique, holistic approach. And to give you a concrete example what we are doing, for first, we change our setting at FAO. FAO, we are a specialized agency. where the countries, our country members, are mostly represented by ministries in charge of agriculture, land, forestry, so all different, but not environment. And biodiversity is always seen, and WHO is discussing at the convention level, it's mostly representative of environment, the same here. And we see that really tendency to have those two agenda connected, environment and land, agriculture, forest, is really taking shape. And the GBF is helping on that. So we set quite recently, in the history of FAO, now we have an office in charge of climate change, biodiversity, and environment, with a dual role to coordinate across the house all the technical divisions, so forestry, fisheries, livestock, on all those different topics to bring some consistency and not to just to work in isolation. And we have developed also climate change strategy and a biodiversity strategy. And what we're doing on day-to-day, basically, we're supporting countries on their shaping their policies. So NBSAP for the biodiversity, but NDCs here for nationally determined contribution in the UNFCCC. And we are trying to align those policies. Because if we want to be very effective, we have to align the policies, and we have also to look at synergies in terms of finance, in terms of investment. And the GEF is a Global Environmental Facility is a very good example because they're responsible for different angles, climate, biodiversity, and other conventions. And they are trying also to do that, looking at synergies on minimizing trade-offs when it's possible. It's not always possible, but we are looking where it is possible or to minimize them where we cannot avoid trade-off. So this is basically what we're doing, supporting countries to align their different policies. For that we are equipping all countries with tools. Perhaps I would mention that later, but we have some tools that are really at the nexus of climate change, biodiversity, to ensure when you have to take decision on how to build a policy, how to implement a project, you are considering the two lenses, climate change, biodiversity, on other lenses, I would say. I will stop here and give the talk.
Thank you very much. And absolutely coming around to that, the policy synergies and looking at the tools that support that. And I think a number of the agencies have various approaches in that. But you also mentioned about food security and issues around resilience. And so, Leanne, I'm going to turn to you next. In terms of building that resilience, obviously disaster risk is being incredibly exacerbated as a result of climate change, and of course biodiversity loss just compounds that. With the midterm review of the Sendai framework and now the push towards 2030, just what sort of support are you providing as UNDRR in this space, please?
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and to everyone online as well, morning, afternoon, or evening. The United Nations Office for Disaster Reduction, UNDRR, has been taking very carefully what has been the outcome of the midterm review that you referenced. One of the findings has been that there are silos. Whilst there are different agencies relating to development or environment or climate change, and not that we're saying you can't have these entities, but the midterm review and parties themselves have been recognizing that there is need for better integration across these different spheres. And of course, biodiversity needs to be part of that. So I would say one of the support, or one area of support that we have been providing, I'm going to classify it as smashing silos. We try to have these catchy phrases, or at least I'm putting this as one option. And this is in different ways. One is the same planning framework that we just heard from Marshall. We have, for example, work on comprehensive risk management approaches. And in that, we try to see how countries can be supported in having more integrated frameworks at the national level. We have been, in particular, working on DRR strategies and plans and national adaptation plans, but we're also integrating biodiversity. Recently, for example, we worked on a product which we call a Nature-Based Solutions Toolkit. And the aim is countries will have this as a tool and a resource that in the development of their DRR strategies or their NAPs, or if they have an integrated plan that captures both, they can use this toolkit to see how to better integrate nature-based solutions in it, and therefore aligns well with the GBF and integrating risk in the development of these plans and these strategies. On another level, we're also working to support how risk is better integrated in the work that countries are now doing to implement the GBF. And we hope that through the comprehensive risk management initiative that I mentioned, we can beef up that level of support. The final point I will say is that we're also digging data. You know, when we talk about digging in English, you know, it's something that you appreciate or that you like. But it's to also acknowledge that data needs to be strengthened because there is a lot of value in it. It's not just collecting data to have data, but it's with a view to have better planning, the evidence base that's required, and thereafter to have stronger resilience, particularly of ecosystems and then the services that are therefore thereafter provided, which is a foundational aspect of the GBF. We have, in the UNDRR, we manage the Desinventar database, and that has been in existence for well over 20 years. And what it does, it provides a framework for countries to be able to track their impact from different, disasters. What we're doing currently is partnering with some organizations, primarily the World Meteorological Organization, as well as the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. And we're now seeing how we can develop this new disaster tracking system that can better integrate the environment, the ecosystems, the nature-based aspect of disasters and impact, and also making the linkages, recognizing that there are compounding, cascading impacts and effects. And what happens in the ecosystems, therefore, has an impact on disaster risk and the impact thereafter. We recently brought together different experts, in particular to focus on slow onset events, because that is also a very critical area of the resilience of ecosystems. And part of what that is intended to do is to see how we can have more streamlined methodologies and initiatives that can track and monitor and assess how ecosystems themselves are impacted, but also how our disaster risk and subsequent impact is also being affected when we have these slow onset events happening. So we're working on different fronts. We're smashing silos and we're digging data, but it's all to ensure that in keeping with the coherence and the integration that is a part of the GBF, that also links very well to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC Convention, and all the other frameworks, and to ensure that there's integration in the work that we're supporting countries with. So I'll leave it there.
That's great. Thank you very much. And absolutely, that assessing and understanding risk right at the very start and feeding that in, both for the slow onset as well as the fast onset, the type of disasters that make it into the news, we need to be more upfront and ready for those. So I'm going to move to Maximilian next. I know with your work, you're working a lot with small island developing states, and obviously they're really at this nexus, to take Valerie's word, in terms of understanding that risk and the need for that resilience. And there was this coalition that was launched at COP28 last year on nature and climate. Can you talk a bit about how you're working to support that, please?
Yes, sure. But before, maybe I can explain why seeds.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about seeds? And then I can talk about the how through the coalition, maybe. And just for the why, maybe I will give some facts and figures. I will not dive into the challenges, because seeds here at COP, everyone knows about the challenges that they are facing. And so I will just really provide figures related to opportunities. So just in terms of the marine features of seeds, for example, 19% of coral reefs in the world are actually in seeds areas. 14% of the coastline worldwide is actually in seeds. If we take only the exclusive economic zone of Seychelles and Mauritius altogether, is actually bigger than the size of India. So this gives you a bit of order of magnitude when we talk about seeds, and it gives you also an idea why we say that seeds are actually large ocean states. And then what is also interesting, with seeds is that they manage to actually transform those marine features into opportunities for marine conservation. If we take, for example, marine protected areas, just to give you an idea, St. Lucia, declared a marine reserve that is the size of Germany. Palau, the marine sanctuary of Palau, is actually twice, the size of Mexico. In terms of environmental financing, just to also take an example, Seychelles is one of the first countries in the world to have issued actually a blue bond. If we take debt swapped, for nature, for example, Belize is one of the first country in the America to have issued a blue bond, a debt swapped for the ocean. I can go on and on and on. Fiji has embarked really recently into ocean accounting, for example. So this gives an idea about why seeds, and seeds, as you can see, they've been leading by example in nature conservation. In collaboration with the CBD Secretariat in 2022, we did a gap assessment to see how we can support seeds in actually even going further to lead by example in those issues. And we find out that there are huge gaps in terms of means of implementation, for seeds. And as a follow-up of that, with seeds countries, and at COP15, we supported seeds to establish a seeds coalition for nature with two main purposes. First one is to advocate as one, because when they are together, they are stronger. But also, and this is the point here I wanted to underline, but also to catalyze partnerships for seeds in the nature agenda to implement actually the GBF. And this, at COP15, they did that with a call for action around 3 priorities related to means of implementation. First priority is about financing for nature. The second one is about knowledge for nature. And the third one is about biodiversity mainstreaming and connections between the different conventions like biodiversity and climate change. So if I take the first priority, and I'm mentioning this in a very collaborative way, because I invite all of us as agencies to be together and to support all this. So for the first priority, for example, together with FAO and UNEP, we developed a seeds ecosystem restoration flagship under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. That flagship actually won an award at the World Restoration Day last year, and this year was launched by the Prime Minister of Belize at the SDG Summit. The main purpose of that flagship is through ecosystem restoration to link up, to have this nexus between environment and economy, actually. To link up environmental restoration with economic restoration, ecosystem management with economic growth. And so, as we speak, we are now developing the inception phase of this initiative. In terms of priority 2, and this is also related to not the nexus, but data, and you both mentioned data. Together with UNESCO, I don't know if we have UNESCO colleagues here, but we developed a partnership between the Seeds Coalition for Nature and the UN Ocean Decade Alliance. And for a joint action framework that is really focusing on ocean knowledge. We mention this a lot, but it's key. Without proper evaluation of ecosystem services, it's very difficult to influence decision makers. Without proper understanding of financial risks related to biodiversity loss, it's very hard to shift the needle for some businesses in their own business plan. So this is another one. And a third one, it's that we launched actually 2 days ago. It's within COPs, with the coalition members, and I'll talk after about the coalition members and the friends. We develop what is called a Seeds Integrated Climate Nature Action Roadmap in coastal areas. Basically, it's a long title, but the focus is quite simple. It's just to boost selected marine protected areas in seeds to be actually to serve as nature-based solutions to climate action. And as part of this roadmap, there is 33 MPAs across 13 seeds that have been selected, and this covers something like 2.5 million of hectares. And this has been launched 2 days ago here at COP at the mangrove event and at the 3030 ministerial event. So a few words, and I should have started with this actually. Sorry, I jumped into the actions and priorities. But the coalition actually is made of, there are 4 co-leads. It's Samoa, Seychelles, Belize, and Capo Verde. It's a gathering of actually 18 seeds across the 3 seeds regions. And there are 15 friends. So it's donor countries that are supporting seeds. So I'll stop here. Thank you. And just here, after, if you want, you all have a partnership business card for the coalition that you can take with all the information. All the proposals are just here.
Thank you very much, Maximilian. That was very comprehensive, but and good to have some materials as well. So please come up and help yourselves after the event. Thanks very much. So we're looking at issues around vulnerability, and of course, a lot of the drivers are external. The SIDS themselves, they're dealing with the impacts of things that are happening outside of their borders, despite being large ocean states. Their relative impact or their relative contribution is quite low, and it's the same for Indigenous peoples. So Hanya, I want to turn to you. You're involved with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, but of course it's about you learning from, respecting, using traditional knowledge, culture, and practices. So how does your work help feed some of these perspectives into these discussions, please?
Okay, thank you. At first, I should apologize for my English because I'm not English speaker, so I may have so many mistakes in my pronunciation and my speech. I am advocating Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous language, and that's why I haven't enough time to improve my English. But why Indigenous peoples are very important in this regard? According to the statistics, even now, 70% of our existing biodiversity are managing by Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. And that's why their knowledge and their appearance and their existence and their involvement is very important. You talked about nature-based solution, and we have it in Kunming-Montreal, and why indigenous peoples are realizing themselves as nature-based solution, because indigenous peoples believe that they are in nature themselves. Recently, I came back from Darwin in Australia, and some Aboriginal elders told us that when aliens came to their land, they categorized them as flora and fauna for just tell them that you are not important to anyone. But they themselves recognize themselves as flora and fauna. And they believe that, yes, we are nature, we ourselves are nature. But you know, why the indigenous peoples are not participating or are not involved very in a good sense in all the discussions? Because the level of our understanding about nature and about biodiversity, about all these things, and the level of our language is somehow different from Western knowledge. But maybe from these platforms and these panels, and by your understanding of the importance of our existence and our involvement, maybe we can find out how we can share our knowledge for our planet and for moving forward. Can I say some example? I have 2 indigenous roots, and I want to talk about how different is the level of our understanding. My grandmother used to, because they are pastoralists, and they are goat keeper. So when they want to migrate from one place to another place, they put one fabric bag on the neck of the front goat with so many holes and local seeds in it. And when they migrate, so these local seeds are pouring on the ground, and the other goat who are following the front goat, they are stepping on that seeds. And whenever they come back, so the land is full of grass, local seeds, local grass. And this is the knowledge. Yes, this is a very little example of a very little community in my country. Just imagine how many of these examples are existing and they are not documenting. And we need some people to help us, to fund us, to document these knowledges. And about the access to fund, I just want to mention that indigenous peoples need the direct access to fund. Yes, somehow some experts decide which funds should go to which country, to which people, and how it should be spent. But imagine even these days, we have 30 countries under sanctions, and you know, somehow the government can overcome these kind of sanctions, but the people on the ground cannot overcome these sanctions, and they cannot achieve no funds. But in my country, at least 40 years, we didn't receive any funds from abroad to work on our knowledge and document these things. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hania. And absolutely, the importance of recognizing and respecting traditional knowledge, but also just how by being that sort of close and that recognition, the importance of the natural environment, the low footprint activities, such as putting the bag of seeds on the goats, it means that you're thinking about the next generation or the people coming behind as well as for them when they come back. Claudia, I've left you to last because UNDP, focusing on sustainable development, obviously biodiversity, climate change, all of these issues really come together through a lot of your work. And I know UNDP works at the global level as well as through the country offices in supporting governments and national actors as well as at the international scene. I know of so many different activities. I'm not really sure which one I should try and sort of prompt you on. So I'll just hand it over to you to talk about some of your work, please.
Well, thank you very much, Tristan. It's definitely tough to be the last one. So I'll try to be brief and concise. But first, I think it's amazing to be able to be part of this distinctive panel, because I think particularly in this COP, where we hear a lot of the solutions are technology-driven, it's really comforting to see that, you know, there's still recognition, and we're actually doing more now to recognize that the technology that is best tested is already out there for all of us, and it really is about restoring ecosystems and putting ecosystemic health, you know, first and foremost, everything, including obviously nature-based solutions, but also ecosystem approaches for adaptation. So I think this is very, very timely. In terms of what UNDP is doing, well, we have first and foremost a very, very large portfolio on climate, about $2 billion globally for projects and programs that address climate mitigation and adaptation issues on the ground as well as policy. And the vast majority of this portfolio is actually, particularly in adaptation, for example, actually takes into account and addresses ecosystems and biodiversity. And there is a reason for this. This is not a coincidence. As you mentioned it yourself, we are a development agency. And what we need to look at, and when you design these you know, projects and initiatives on the ground with stakeholders and communities, you know, they don't see this sort of siloed distinction of climate and biodiversity. What they see is an initiative that is going to help them have better livelihoods, more resilience, yes, to the impacts of climate change, but also to their own, you know, economic systems, to their health, for example, as well, right? So we always look at this triple benefit. Yes, we need to have mitigation benefits, we need to have adaptation benefits for resilience, and also this needs to bring forward biodiversity. And all of this is for the improvement of, in and of itself, the social aspect of everything that we do. On the same token, we have about a $3 billion portfolio on nature. It's tagged as nature and biodiversity. But again, if you look at it, the interconnectedness between the portfolio, nature, and how that contributes to mitigation and adaptation is massive. And this includes over 200 projects on protected areas, for example, because we know that protected areas, again, really contribute a lot to you know, global cooling. And also, there is an effort now, more recently, to also take a look and see and analyze what are the climate risks on these protected areas. One initiative, actually, that comes to mind is UNDP is a key partner of the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. We actually supported even the development of the program that is partly funded by the Green Climate Fund, but it's actually a blended finance vehicle for also impact investors and grant facilities. And what they look at, as I was hearing my colleagues speaking about SIDS, is putting a value in the ecosystem. We know that coral reefs, of course, are being, you know, impacted by climate change, but that's not the reason that we need to save them. Businesses are interested in putting, you know, investment on this, because they know two things. There's a massive cost to the business and to the economy of the country if something happens to these reefs, because then if they don't exist, then, you know, all of the businesses and livelihoods that depend on them will not be able to survive. So there's a massive cost. And there is a massive value as well, because then you also increase your resilience to the future of climate change. And also, you know, businesses are looking into that, right? So all of this is to say that there is a reason for this. It also has to do with synergizing efforts for better finance, access to finance as well. And in terms of the policy instruments, well, we have two main programs that are flagship programs. One of them is the Climate Promise. The North Star of the Climate Promise is really to help countries. We work with over 120 countries in improving and increasing the ambition of their NDCs. and also to help them implement these NDCs. And the other one is the Nature Pledge that really looks at supporting over 140 countries in aligning, in actually being able to achieve their targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework. And a key aspect of both projects is the partnerships that we are creating. On the one hand, for example, we work very closely with the NDC partnership. We actually had an event hosted by them yesterday, and also with the NBSAP Accelerator Program. And they both work as a sort of a broker of country-driven needs on biodiversity and climate, and the partners that can actually help, procure, provide tools, training, and also finance. And one thing I would say, just in terms of, because we are in a climate COP and how these NDCs are integral part of the Paris Agreement, and they're actually, an obligation, right, of all the Paris Agreement parties, is that we've seen an improvement in the first generation of NDCs towards the second. So in this second generation, we've seen, for example, there's 90% of them that include targets on forests, on nature-based solutions. What we do in UNDP is ensure precisely that nature-based solutions are not just carbon solutions. This is not something we use to capture carbon. How do we make sure that indigenous people's safeguards are addressed? How do we make sure that social safeguards are addressed? And biodiversity, because you can't just plant trees for the sake of planting trees. You have to make sure you look at, the types of species that will actually bring resilience. 70% of the NDCs identify, for example, action on oceans for climate resilience. So now we're embarking on the third generation of NDCs. And these two programs that we are implementing, pretty much jointly, and actually alongside many of you here, we want to make sure that biodiversity targets, many of them which are already being, planned and put forward through MBSAPs and other instruments, national adaptation plans as well, that are really made more prominent in the third generation of NDCs as solutions that have, again, this sort of multiple benefit, right? Including also access to finance, because financiers also don't see this as a climate project or a biodiversity project. If you speak to the private sector that was here, they blend all of these lines. And obviously, NDCs are, at the end, also an instrument to attract funding and be able to plan funding and financing for your climate solutions. So I think, I will just probably leave it at that, given that we have a limited time. But thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm really glad to see that there's still a group of people that bring this forward.
Thanks very much, Claudia, and sorry that we can't give you more time, because obviously there's so much that UNDP is doing. We are running out of time, but I just want to see if maybe we have time for one or two questions from the audience, if anyone has anything burning. Yeah, there's a hand coming up there. Is there a microphone? Great. And if you could introduce yourself, please.
Took a few seconds out of my intervention. Sorry, hi, I'm Pierre. I also work for UNDP. Some of you mentioned some great interagency initiatives at the global level, for example, LIAN between UNDR, UNDP, WMO, and Maximilian works at the Secretariat. I wondered at the country office level, how would you capitalize, maximize the interactions, complementarity between the different UN agencies? Does the resident coordination office systems have a role to play in this, the development coordination system? Just a quick question on interagency work at the country level. Thank you.
Yes, we have many ways to work at country level. For you mentioned one, the UN resident coordinator. This is his role to do that. It works. It depends of country to country. It can be efficient, more efficient, less efficient. Also at headquarter level, because we have joint program most of the time. So UNDP, for instance, we have a joint FAO, the SCALA program. With UNDR, we have a joint program. With IFAD, we have a joint program. So it's also a way having joint programming that are global, but with country action where you have joint action. So we have those, I would say, the top down and the bottom up approach, and also the government. The government are also more and more asking UN agencies and other stakeholders to collaborate on bringing them together. So this is a tendency we can see, at least from FAO side, government asking agencies to really assemble and have a joint proposition or to be in the room together. So this is a third way also, so 3 ways.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add, one thing I forgot in my previous intervention was to say that the Nature-Based Solutions Toolkit that we developed was actually in partnership with the United Nations University. But also going to the question, the UNDRR does not have country offices, but we do have regional offices. And in the implementation of some of our initiatives, so as an example, with the Comprehensive Risk Management program that I mentioned before, we work through our regional offices and they have interactions with those at the country level. I can also say, as an example, we had an event in the Caribbean in the summer, in July, and in so doing, we had our regional office that was leading on that initiative, but we also ensured that we engaged with the UN offices that were present at the national level. And so they were very much involved, very much participating, aware, and able to support in whatever way that was required, and also to support in the sustainability of what the countries themselves have expressed as a need going forward.
Well, yeah, I think I would echo that. I mean, I worked myself in the regional hub of Panama, and we did actually a lot of collaboration with UNDRR on aligning precisely policies of, that came out in the NAPs with the DRR, policies as well, and also with UNEP, again, on national adaptation plans. I say actually probably works better at the regional level. It's easier than it is at the headquarters level, because then you actually are working with a certain group of countries and they are much more familiar in these regional hubs with the stakeholders of the countries, and so it's a lot easier of a conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Actually, for the Secretariat, I mean, for us, we are based in New York. We don't have, country offices. So partnerships is the only way. That's why when I mentioned the 2 examples with FAO and UNEP and with UNESCO, they have, country offices, and we work together with RCOs at the coordination. But we would love to work also with UNDP. There are many ways, we could work as well.
Unfortunately, time is against us, but unless... No? Okay, great. Thank you very much for that very important question. If we can carry on for another couple of minutes, I know we're over time. Yeah, okay, that's great. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. For the disaster risk reduction, because in my country, the farmers used to be linked with meteorological stations where they can tell them drought or rain is coming what time, seasonality. But for your organization, how do you communicate with people to be ready if anything come up like floods or drought?
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Muna from Sudan, University of Khartoum, Institute of Environmental Studies.
Thanks for your question. There are multiple responses that one could give for that, but given that we're almost out of time, what I will say is 2 things. One, there is an initiative that the UNDRR is co-lead on, which is the Early Warning for All initiative. From what you've mentioned, it's how do the farmers know, for example, there might be a drought coming, and to be able to better prepare for that. The initiative is one that the UN Secretary General is very keen on seeing implemented for everyone to have coverage of early warning system. And that is the intent. And so the UNDRR is partnering with other organizations which will then have impact on the ground to be able to better equip the farmers or the average citizen with information to be able to respond and to be better prepared in the event of early warning system. And secondly, on the comprehensive risk management side, Sudan was actually one of the countries that had requested support, and through the regional office, we were able to start engaging with Sudan to strengthen the planning frameworks, because ultimately it is through the national planning systems that there is impact also filtering to the local level, because the government, the state, has ultimate responsibility, but when they need the support and the capacity and they reach out, then we do what we can to strengthen, to help, and to, in the end, hope that that will then filter to the farmers and those on the ground. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we need to wrap up. Like I mentioned at the start, so the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's a comprehensive, fairly ambitious framework to try and put us on track to living in harmony with nature. And of course, climate change is referenced in a couple of the targets specifically, but of course, it's relevant across all of them. And we've heard a bit about marine protected areas, whether marine or terrestrial. And certainly the 30 by 30 target is one of the sort of the headline ones that a lot of people have picked up on. But in a sense, there are actually three 30 by 30 targets. There's the protected areas and other effective conservation measures, the ecosystem restoration, which is very important, and also in terms of finance, the mobilization of $30 billion in official ODA by 2030. So in a sense, it's 30 by 30 by 30 by 30. But that's maybe less catchy for some, or confusing. But in any case, but of course, it's about cooperation, synergies, and UN agencies play a very central role in that. And I thank you very much for your question about how does this actually manifest itself at the national level? How do agencies come together in order to support? And certainly, if you talk to a lot of national focal points for the CBD, they're somewhat overwhelmed already by just their tasks in terms of focusing on the convention, but then you need to have all of this other support mechanism that's around them, and how does that all come together to actually make a substantive difference, both in terms of biodiversity, but especially also on climate change. So there's a role for all of us to play, and thank you very much, Hania, for raising the importance of how people are being affected sometimes by the politics of things, but certainly how within at a national level they are being recognized and respected. And it's not just Western science, but also other forms of knowledge. And certainly, in terms of the tools and the monitoring and the data that's available, it all needs to come together to put us all working in the same direction and ultimately making that difference. So thank you very much to our esteemed panel members. Thank you to you all and to those online who are watching for being with us today. And enjoy the last few hours pretty much of COP, whenever it will end. But anyway, all the best. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everyone to this event on integrating actions for climate and biodiversity, opportunities and potential. My name is Raydan Al-Saqaf and I'm the economist at the United Nations Resident Coordinator Office in the UAE. And we're joined with a distinguished panel to touch on this very important issue here at UNEP's Pavilion at COP28. To start with, we must remember that there are some critical elements in climate action that require particular attention in relation to its links with biodiversity. King Charles, who is the high-profile campaigner for the planet, described our actions as a frightening experiment of changing every ecological condition, all at once, at a pace that outstrips nature's ability to cope. The Secretary General also said something similar in terms of humanity's fate is hanging in the balance. So I asked you, what starker words do we need to focus our climate work around biodiversity preservation and restoration? For us and the United Nations system, we respond to the priorities that the world identifies for us. And I must say, as COP28 shows, that multilateralism is our only chance of addressing these issues. It is our best bet in nudging the conversation forward and in terms of addressing the dual challenges of climate action and biodiversity preservation. Through this panel, we're focusing on this particular dynamic building on a recent primer that a number of academic partners has put together, entitled Building Synergies Between Climate and Biodiversity Governance, a primer for COP28, as well as the associated policy brief. So this primer will help us shed some insights in terms of what kind of actions can we take in order to move forward on both agendas. So to introduce my panel, we will start with Professor Natalie Seddon, who is the founding director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford. We're joined also with my colleague, Mr. Ubaid Al-Shamisi, who is the chief biologist at the UAE Ministry for Climate Change and Environment. We also have Filippo Berardi, a senior climate change specialist at the Global Environment Facility, and Mirlani Rai, director of Women for Biodiversity. So welcome, everyone. So to start with, I'd like to start with a question for Professor Natalie. So here you go. Tell us about this primer. It's been 30 years since the Rio Convention and the Rio Conference. Why are we still pursuing both agendas separately?
Well, let me just take a wee step back before I dive into directly answering that question. We've had a great deal about nature-based solutions at this COP, and a great deal, in fact, with increasing intensity and ferocity over the last 2 or 3 years. But we need to be really clear, I think, on 3 critical points. And that is that there are no solutions from nature. There's no solutions from the biosphere unless we, first of all, dramatically reduce emissions and we keep fossil fuels in the ground. Because unless we do, the resultant warming is going to turn, and is already turning parts of, the biosphere from a net sink of greenhouse gases into a net source of greenhouse gases. That's why offsetting doesn't work. We need to do both, right? We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and we need to restore and work with our ecosystems. That's number one. The second thing, we don't get any solutions from nature unless we look after the health of nature, which, incidentally, our own health is intimately related to. And the health of our ecosystems depends upon the biodiversity of those ecosystems. In other words, the diversity, the heterogeneity of those ecosystems, right down from the level of the gene to the level of the ecosystems. And the science, and indeed the knowledge from traditional wisdom, is that the more diverse or the more natural the levels of diversity are within those ecosystems, the more able they are to produce the innumerable values that humans get from working with nature as part of nature. So whether you're interested in carbon storage, whether you're interested in adaptation, in livelihoods, in rights, in poverty alleviation, in water security, whatever it is that you care most passionately about, or whether it is just part of your spiritual identity and who you are, you don't get any of these benefits unless you protect biodiversity. So biodiversity is a foundational property of nature-based solutions. And the third and equally important point is that there are no solutions from nature unless you work with the indigenous communities and the local people and respect their rights and knowledges. They often have hugely intimate, deep spiritual, cultural connections. They also have an enormous amount of important knowledge about how to work with nature in general and in a warming world. So it is not only unjust to not engage at that level and not to be led by those indigenous communities, it also means that the sustainability, the resilience of those ecosystems will not be maintained. So it's really with this as a backdrop that we put together this primer, recognizing that this COP is a crucial moment, a real opportunity, especially ahead of a year with 3 Rio Convention COPs taking place next year, to really think about how we can really harmonize action between climate change and biodiversity loss, and incidentally addressing desertification, poverty, and so forth. Lots of people have spoke about this, and in fact, when the Rios were established way back in the early 90s, that was the idea, that we'd have these separate conventions, but that these communities would work together. What happens in practice is, as you said, they've actually been working in isolation. So these communities of scientists, practitioners, and policymakers have been working in silos. Partly that's because it's just very hard, and we've got a lot of work to do, and some specialization is sometimes needed. But part of that is because different sorts of people have been occupying these spaces. You know, often the climate change space is dominated by physical scientists. There aren't any ecologists or enough ecologists or social scientists working within that community. And similarly on the biodiversity side, not enough carbon scientists and physicists. And so it's partly, in terms of the underlying science, it's partly a reflection of that and the need to overcome these silos. That's a common language we hear, but that's partly part of the explanation. But there has been an opportunity, been broad recognition of this. There was a workshop that produced a report, the first one between the IPCC and IPBES a couple of years ago, that made the point that, as you hear time and again at this and other conferences, that we can't address one crisis without addressing the other. And so we're really trying to say, well, what does that really mean in practice? What do we really need to do? And so we pulled this together. So this is a collaboration. There was a report produced for the UN Residence Coordinator's Office here in UAE, but it involved universities of Oxford, Durham, Rabolt, Utrecht, PBL Netherlands Environment Agency, IDRI, and my own organisation, the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. I was an author, but a major co-author is in the audience here, Audrey Wagner, who knows a great deal about the contents of this. I'm looking at her thinking maybe she should be talking about the primer, because she had a huge input in the content and making it happen. So thank you, Audrey. And we came up with 10 critical areas of activity that needs to happen in the coming months and years. I'm not going to go through all 10 of them, don't worry. Please read the report and find out what they are. But the 3 broad areas were, first of all, we really need to look at the indirect drivers, or more foundational drivers. So we need to think about transformation. We need to think about subsidies and repurposing those. We need to think about pollution and consumption and overconsumption, and really tackling those by reconfiguring our economy that is in service of life rather than material wealth, that is in service of enhancing the web of life. We need to do that. And that is involving there's all sorts of ways we could make that happen, but we really need to not forget about that, because everything else, quite frankly, is papering over the cracks unless we tackle some of that critical transformational stuff. So there's some actions around that we talked about. We also talked about the need to scale up funding and finance and enhance nature-based solutions, but make sure we do so really understanding the social guardrails, the ecological, the social, the biodiversity guardrails are needed to avoid nature-based solutions continuing to be co-opted by those who wish to greenwash, by those who don't wish to do the really hard business of high integrity. So lots of guidelines around those standards. And then more practically, let's see the alignment between the CBD and the UNFCCC, great joint statement that came out a couple of days ago, with a real commitment by both those bodies to work together and co-create targets that harmonise rather than contradict one another. And so aligning the NDCs with the MBSAPs, let's bring the NAPs in there, let's have the adaptation, the mitigation and the biodiversity policy all working together in a joined up coherent way. Otherwise you're going to get trade-offs, otherwise you're going to get policy for carbon that harms biodiversity, policy for biodiversity that undermines our ability to draw down and store carbon, adaptation policy that isn't reflecting enough the needs of the global south, which have a high dependency on nature. So all this was discussed in a lot more detail. So I know you're coming away from this conference with 1 million reports to read later, and you might not get to them, but I would say this is a particularly important one to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. It is indeed an important mission. We had an earlier event at COP with USG Ibrahim Thia, who is the Executive Secretary of the Desertification Convention. And when he asked him, he said, aren't we talking about the same planet? So therefore, we have to work together in direct alignment. Maybe you face that issue as a policymaker, Abed. So how are you using biodiversity actions to advancing your national climate change ambition?
Thank you, Redan, and thank you, everyone. Professor Natalie, I absolutely agree with you. We can't work in separation, biodiversity and climate change. And all these aspects, we cannot afford not to work together at this stage. I think with COP28, UAE realized this, that this is an opportunity to bring all conventions together, Rio conventions, and basically start building bridges between, let's say, CBD, UNFCCC, and all major Rio conventions. And on a national level in UAE, beginning last year, we started to have national talks that involved all of our sectors in UAE, whether it be industry, energy, etc., and biodiversity as well, and nature, to integrate those aspects to climate change and bring climate change to them. Because if we discuss climate change in general, it might be a little bit hard to understand for the normal humans who's working in the field and he's in the factory focusing on producing the outcome. Maybe he won't understand his contribution to the global issue of climate change. So it was very important for us to bring the awareness to those people and make sure that everyone involved in climate change is engaged in the talks in UAE. And when it comes to biodiversity in UAE, we are guided by our National Biodiversity Action Strategy and Action Plan. And one of the major goals there is to maintain or basically to enable nature-based solutions to ensure nature-positive policies and also have a more resilient climate. And in UAE, basically, what we have been doing is developing and making sure that all nature aspects in UAE are resilient to climate change. So, for example, for mangroves and wetland ecosystems, we have been studying them. And as you may know and already heard, during this COP, we pledged to plant 100 million mangroves by 2030, and we are well in the way of making that happen. It's an understanding since the 70s from our founding father that mangroves provide us here in UAE, which is a dry climate, and we don't have forests. It's our forest in UAE. And they provide us with so many services, whether it's ecosystem services, producing honey, ecotourism, being able to sequester carbon, which we came recently to understand this. This is something we didn't know before. So we are capitalizing in those benefits, but we are also not leaving behind seagrass, microalgae, all these silicornia, which is an amazing plant here in UAE, and it's growing in saline environments. So this is great for us. We have salinity, we have sun, and we have soil. So we're growing silicornia and utilizing its benefit and making sure that those plants or those species that have benefits and resilience for our biodiversity and resilience to climate change are integrated into our policies. So through all this, we're working, and we know the task is big, to make sure that nature is an important aspect when we talk about the climate change and climate solutions. So we are integrating it into our solutions and making sure that nature is at center stage. And we're very proud of what have been done here in COP28 with nature getting a bigger stage. And yeah, this is all showcase how we, UAE as policymakers here, integrate nature into climate change talks.
Thank you very much, Obaid. It's interesting to see a biodiversity-based approach for climate action. So therefore, climate action will be addressed through that lens. And also the efforts, the different initiatives, and the ambition that the ministry has. Maybe we can move to Filippo with a question about finance. So the fourth recommendation from the primer, which I've learned that you've enjoyed very much, so if you haven't read it, find it. Recommendation 4 of the primer refers to aligning financing for climate and biodiversity. How do you see that happening?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invite, the opportunity to be here. representing the Global Environment Facility. I did enjoy the report very much, and while reading it, it's sort of like really, you realize it tracks very, very closely what we've been trying to do at the Global Environment Facility, considering the special position and observatory that we occupy in the sort of climate finance space, right? We are one of the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. At the same time, we have that same function under CDB and under the UNCCD. So in a way, this integration between the objectives that the three Rio Convention have established happens institutionally when it comes to the GEF. And this is not always the case in all financial institutions or DFIs. So we have really leveraged and tried to build on this special sort of identity of the GEF in the definition of the investment strategies and the type of menu of activities that we can support countries in the implementation of their NDCs, but also obviously on their biodiversity plans. And I was going to mention a few things related to science, but I'm glad that Nathalie did that work for me. So, I mean, I think everybody attending here is fully convinced that the science is clear and that climate and biodiversity, the two twin crises, need to be tackled together for us to have any chance to succeed. And also, it is clear that nature, in a way, provided that we are serious on our sort of reduction to the addiction to fossil fuels, which is a precondition that is condition sine qua non. We absolutely have to start with that. But if that is somehow taken care of, then nature becomes the climate greatest ally. There are more than 50% of the sort of reduction that we can that we need by 2030 that can be achieved through nature-based solutions. So we are fully committed to support countries on this agenda. It is also clear that the drivers at the basis of the climate and the nature and biodiversity crisis are often the same. So tackling those drivers will produce multiple benefits in terms of both biodiversity, land degradation, and climate change. I'm talking about investment in regenerative agriculture. I'm talking in investment related to sustainable food systems, and obviously everything that is related to forest conservation, including through the great work that has been done at community level and indigenous people level. I think there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done to take all of the references to nature that currently exist in NDCs. About 100 NDCs already talk about nature in terms of a tool to realize their climate ambition, but only a fraction of that have actual targets. And then there is a lot of work that needs to be done to, at national level, to downscale those targets into a specific institutional coordination structure between the different decision makers that often are involved in defining the climate policy or defining the biodiversity policy that often don't talk to each other in the way that will be needed for it to be really an integrated climate and biodiversity solution. So there's definitely need to build bridges. These bridges are needed both at international financial institution level and at national level. So what can we done for that? We've noted that sort of disconnect in the last replenishment cycle. The GEF work in 4-year cycles. We're right now about halfway through the 8th cycle, and with the pressure from some of our donors, we've came out with this program. It's called the Net Zero Nature Positive Accelerator. It is a pilot envelope of about 130 million, so it is not going to solve the entire problem, but it's a good start. The Net Zero Nature Positive Accelerator, it sort of provide funding to the countries at the condition that proposals that are received to us come already with an ambition to create that interinstitutional, intergovernmental structure to ensure that implementation of NBSAPs and NDCs is done through a committee, and these plans and investments are done and are discussed in an integrated way. We have 12 countries that have been selected. The idea is to work both upstream to make sure that there is policy coherence between the policies that are adopted for decarbonization and the policies that are adopted to protect nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services. For us, this issue of policy coherence, which closely linked to all of the discussion around subsidies, both not just for fossil fuels, but in the agricultural space as well, is one of the most important discussion that must be had. And imagine you have a bucket, and you try to fill this bucket with new water, and that's money. But the bucket has holes, and so every time you put more money, more water would be lost. Anyway, you would never be able to fill it. And that's a little bit what happens with the lack of policy coherence. You have different departments, different planning, they all work in silos, and you can't row in the same direction. So the idea of this program is to provide socioeconomic, macro modeling capabilities that can help governments to understand what it means to bring together these different objectives in a way, in a coordinated long-term net zero nature positive strategy at 2050, and then what it means to break down this strategy in 5-year installments to see what happened at 2025, 2030, and what are the best investments that can help using the very scarce amount, unfortunately, of public sector highly concessional grant funding, leverage private sector investment and open the space through de-risking, and eventually make sure that we can start with a number of very highly visible pilot investments that we can extract from these initial 12 countries and be used at global level as an initial repository of knowledge and of investment activities that can be hopefully spread across the community that's interested both on the climate side and on the biodiversity side.
Well, thank you very much, Felipe, for that detailed reflection. The nature positive the net zero nature positive initiative is not only an incentive, but it's actually the smart thing to do, to bridge those holes in the bucket. But there will be a number of other challenges in terms of making sure that these initiatives engage everybody, including the community. So maybe I can move on to Ms. Rai with asking you a little bit to help us ground the international frameworks on this issue. Last December, we had the CPD COP15 adopting the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And this builds on the Aichi targets. And the question is that, would it work on the ground in terms of advancing climate action? What's your take? I understand that you've done a lot of fantastic work at the community level, so we want to hear.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and really happy to be here. And to me, I think following both climate and biodiversity, I'm a biodiversity hardcore person. To see the discussions around climate, again, taking the advancement of looking at biodiversity now. The work on synergies, and I'll take, Felipe, from you, the coherence and synergies is not new. This has been talked about within the UN system for many years. But there's always been this lack of looking at where those bridges could be made, right? Because I tell people one of the first thing is that why do we really need to work hard? Because practically the same parties to the conventions are the same, right? So you have the UNCCD, the Rio conventions. So now that we are looking at these links between biodiversity and climate, we shouldn't also forget, and I think all the speakers did mention, is land. So let's not also wait a few COPs to suddenly realize that, actually, oops, we didn't put land there. What you're talking about, like the recent high-level roundtable ambition, right, looks at these links, and I'm really happy to see that going forward, links with the KMGBF, which is a Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we're talking about coherence. I always talk to people is that they are the three Rio sisters. I tell them the triplets, right? I tell them that UNFCCC is Miss Universe. Everybody knows her. Then you have Miss CBD, which is like Miss Earth, Miss World. People sometimes follow her. And poor Miss Earth, nobody even follows, which is UNCCD. But they all are triplets, like you pointed out. They're all born out of the 1992 Earth Rio Summit. So if I was to even talk to my child at home, knows about climate change, but doesn't really see the link between land and biodiversity. And this is where the narrative we really need to shift, that it's not different, but they are linked up and complement each other. So though we are looking at biodiversity for climate action, I also say that, no, you need biodiversity action to mitigate climate. That narrative, we really need to see that. And as I think all of you talked about drivers, right? For me, climate is a symptom, right? It's something that I cannot grasp. I'm still learning about it. And most of the discussion that I've seen around here is on biodiversity and land. So the solutions are in those critical biodiverse ecosystems, functions that are very diverse. And it's not only been nature. I always talk about the circle of life. If you're following the CBD, we're always talking about living in harmony with nature. And nature is not only species and trees and forest and water. When we talk about ecosystem functions and services, we are talking about traditional knowledge, right? We're talking about how everybody has a right to a healthy environment. You're talking about species. You're talking about including from invasive alien species to fish, to DSI, this is the digital sequence information, to people, to forest. So the biodiversity, we need to really understand the diversity of species, and this also include people. So when we're talking about looking at those synergies, we really need to also make sure that when we are having these discussions around what the solutions should be, we also really need to look at the holistic solutions in there. Now, again, just on the synergy part of that, one of the things, if you're talking about the CBD, it has 4 goals and 23 targets. It's a sister Rio Convention, which recognizes a right to a healthy environment. It recognizes that indigenous peoples and local communities' rights should be respected. It talks very explicitly on gender equality and women's empowerment with a standalone target, which is target 23. So when I come to this climate, I talk about synergies. I said that, once you have at the same equal footing, you have a Rio Convention making that commitment, let's not bring that bar low. We either maintain it, right? We're talking about synergies. Let's not water it down. When just a year ago, the CBD Convention has put aside these principles to guide the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, where all the climate solutions apparently exist, also with Target 8, and there are a few others that talk about climate change. That means we're talking about addressing Target 8 on specific on climate change. That means to also implement Target 8, you also really need to make sure that you have the whole of society approach, which is also in the outcome document here presented by the presidencies of the Rio Conventions and other parties and organizations, but also addressing, we're talking about the whole of society approach and where these big discussions are going around just transition, energy, fossil fuels, to really ensure that we don't have unintended consequences. Again, we will be all the solutions that you're talking about, also understanding that they really have to be embedded into inclusivity, participation, transparency, and I always talk about one thing is accountability. If we don't take that into considerations, a lot of these solutions, I'll give you an example of renewables. Those are one of the biggest drivers of also displacement and biodiversity loss, right? We're talking about hydropower, we're talking about big things. So we're talking about that. So one time you talk about making sure that everybody has access to climate and it's everybody, whole of society. So just to really ensure that when we're talking about these solutions, to really also take these social aspects into consideration, that in that big, huge transition that we're talking about, that we really do no harm, whether knowingly and unknowingly. And so we really need to make sure that some of these key principles that have been discussed in the international arenas should complement each other. Otherwise, to be honest, if we don't take it on and we keep trying to create the same thing over and over again, we'll always be working in silos. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Tina. We move at the speed of bureaucracy in the UN. So therefore, it will take us a bit of time in order to try to action these steps. But we are now at COP28. So perhaps in the limited time we still have left, I can ask you all to give us like a one-liner statement in terms of how can COP28 put nature at the center of the climate agenda. We can follow the same order, perhaps? Starting with.
By being very clear that it's not climate then nature, it's climate and nature at the same time. But recognizing that there are no solutions from nature unless we keep fossil fuels in the ground, recognizing that nature is a powerful ally for climate change mitigation, but it's only 27% of greenhouse gas emissions, and we only get that 27% if we also keep fossil fuels in the ground. So we must be really careful to be really, really clear on that. But the flip side of that argument is that the myopic focus on net zero without any regard for indigenous communities and biodiversity will mean that we might get a cooler planet, but it won't be habitable. So this is why we need to do both these things at the same time. And core to all of that is removing perverse subsidies that continue to destroy the biosphere and the climate, because unless we do that, everything else is papering over the cracks.
Thank you, Natalie.
I'll keep it short. I think the biggest, or what we should take from COP28, or what we should focus on COP28 is nature is the biggest ally to climate action. Without nature, we can't really achieve climate action fully. And as the Professor Natalie said, have a habitable planet by 2050.
Well said. Thank you, Abid.
Well, I think the topic of nature, I'm very happy that already from Glasgow to COP26, we've seen some good text about nature in the Climate Convention. And there is really a momentum that I can see both in the policymakers and in the finance world, where this recognition about the inevitability of dealing with nature and climate at the same time is happening. I think the key point now is to start really trickling down the concept of integration at national level and make sure that all of the planning processes that is related to economic development takes at the same time into consideration climate and nature, and investments that are done have the same metrics to assess climate. The same strong metric that we use to assess climate are also identified and utilized in the context of the objectives for nature.
Thank you, Philippa.
I think when we say nature for all, that I would also really make sure that the COP28 definitely adheres to that, because that also means that every single person, the whole of society, has a right to a healthy environment. Not a certain sector, not a certain division of peoples, it is everyone. So we really need to really keep that to the core to our work. The second one, I want to put it up, is financing. Just quickly looking at that is that I hope that people or parties would also commit to their commitments to financing in the Global Biodiversity Fund also, where I see a lot of commitments here with new initiatives. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Biodiversity Fund that was established last year so far only has 2 party commitments. So it'll be very good that parties put money in that fund for the implementation and to look at these synergies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tina. And thanks to the panel for a very interesting discussion. This is one of a long series of events that are organized along this theme. It's not a new topic, as you rightly mentioned. And we want to make sure that we keep this momentum looking forward for COP29 and beyond that, and how we can further integrate actions on the ground to maximize the benefit from both agendas. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And we hope that COP28 will achieve the aspiration that we hope for. Thank you.